I am honored to welcome a distinguished public servant for a virtual fireside chat. As Secretary of Defense under both the Bush and Obama administrations, Robert Gates embodies patriotic bipartisan statesmanship. Secretary Gates served 8 U.S. presidents in total across both parties. He spent nearly 27 years as an intelligence professional, including 9 years on the National Security Council, and he is the only career officer in the CIA's history to rise from entry-level employee to director. He continues to serve his country in numerous ways, including as founder of the Gates Global Policy Center. With his remarkable career of service, Secretary Gates is an authority not only on bipartisanship, but also on the geopolitical impacts we could face if bipartisanship continues to break down. We're so honored he's joining us virtually today. Please join me in welcoming Secretary Robert Gates.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, we're excited to have you. We can see you. I hope you can hear us. It sounds like you can. I want to start with this. You got on our radar as we were looking at this initiative a few months ago on Face the Nation, where Margaret Brennan asked you what the #1 threat to the United States was. I expected you to talk about Putin or Xi Jinping and China. Instead, you responded that it was the level of polarization in our country. Now, of course, that stood out to me because one of the things I hear in response to our Disagree Better initiative is that we're sometimes overreacting a little bit, that we may be a little impolite, but we've always been this way, and we'll work our way out of it, and that this hand-wringing is kind of silly. We heard an amazing speech earlier showing what a difficult situation we're really in. But that kind of attitude worries me because I think we need to take this toxic polarization much more seriously. So could you talk a little bit more about why you answered the question that way and how you see this threat evolving?
Sure, and I'm happy to be with you all this morning. I think that, first of all, it's important to start with the fact we have always had polarized politics in this country. And there were things said in the Jefferson-Adams race in 1800 that would fit right in with the presidential campaign today in terms of the nasty things that were said. I think the problem is that polarization now has reached a point where it has led to paralysis. And so we have very difficult time coming up with policies that can be sustained no matter who is in the White House. So one of the ways we prevailed in the Cold War was we had a consistent policy or a consistent strategy under 9 successive presidents of both parties. It's hard to imagine coming up with that now. So I think that's the paralysis is the problem that I have. And just as an example, we have not had a defense appropriations bill passed by the Congress before the start of the fiscal year since 2010. That leads to continuing resolutions that are completely disruptive to the budgetary process. They can't start anything new. They can't increase the funding going to existing programs and so on. And then, of course, we have the current impasse over the confirmation of senior military officials, which is having a devastating effect inside the military. So the situation, all you have to do is look at the Congress now to see how polarization has created these enormous problems. And the question is, yes, they can pass things, but they tend to be passed by overwhelming majorities based on one party or the other, and that calls into question the sustainability of that policy after there's a change in leadership in the White House or in the Congress itself. So it's this paralysis at a time when we face very aggressive foreign adversaries such as Russia and China, who are now working together more closely probably than ever in their history. That presents some real challenges for us, and we can't even get a defense budget passed.
Thank you. I think we share your concern, the paralyzation that's happening in Congress for sure. I have two questions. Let's focus internationally first. A few of us were at an event last year with the ambassador from Switzerland, and he gave a very powerful message to us, talking about his concern as someone with a perspective from Europe, from another country. He talked glowingly about the U.S. leadership on the international stage throughout the last century, World War I, World War II. You mentioned the Cold War, how at every turn when the world was in danger, they looked to the United States for leadership. And then he expressed a concern that he felt that they were worried that they could no longer do that because we were so polarized at home, fighting over things that didn't matter, and he that there is a vacuum there for leadership across the globe, that with these dark clouds on the horizon, that there's no one stepping in to fill that void. If the United States isn't there, then the world is in some ways lost. And I'm paraphrasing, but I'm wondering, are you hearing that? Are you feeling that? Are you seeing that with our allies and democracies across the globe? How are they seeing what's happening in the United States today?
I think what you see around the world is the question is President Biden's policy of strengthening alliances and engagement around the world a one-off, or is President Trump's America First, more isolationist agenda going to be the dominant theme in the future? And the truth is, nobody in the world knows. And the result is, even our closest allies are hedging. They're looking to how do you have policies that allow you to jump either way or don't get in the way. So, for example, you've had more visits by the leaders of Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE to Moscow and Beijing in the last 2 years than you have had them coming to Washington, D.C. So what you have, apropos of the comments of the ambassador, is the rest of the world not knowing whether the United States will be there if things get even tougher than they are now. And that basically leaves open field running for the Russians and the Chinese, and particularly in the global South. So, I'm a firm believer, and going back to his comment, the ambassador's comments, I mean, who is going to pick up that mantle of leadership in terms of organizing the West, organizing the democracies, if it's not the United States? And if we're not willing to pick that up, then the world, I think, is in a pretty difficult spot right now. And there is a moment of opportunity here because of the aggressiveness, particularly of Xi Jinping in China. There is a consensus or a very broad agreement on the Hill, however fragile, bipartisan consensus of the need to be very tough on China. And that may provide something to build on. I think that the president and political leaders in both parties have not done a good job of trying to persuade the American people why resisting what Russia is doing in Ukraine and why resisting China and so on is important. But there is at least some basis for hope that we could get something done vis-a-vis China. The problem is there's just a huge gap between that consensus with respect to China and then getting positive votes in the Congress to actually do something about it.
Thank you. Now, let's focus internally at home when it comes to recruitment and strengthening our military. Are you seeing this toxic polarization in our country impacting the strength of our actual military and our ability to recruit new members?
Well, I think this is a very broad social problem in this country, and my nephew teaches high school, and yesterday, even on 9/11, when the time came to say the Pledge of Allegiance, Not one kid in his classroom stood up to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. So I think, and they weren't protesting anything. They were just apathetic. They didn't care. They didn't see the importance of why that made any difference. So I think you've had so many political leaders disparage, and frankly, a lot of educators and others disparaging the United States and our role in history, and sort of focused wholly on the negative, that young people don't see any need. Why would young people be willing to put their lives on the line for something they don't see worth defending? And I think this is a very deep problem in the country. It's taken us a long time to get to this sad state, and I think it'll take a long time to get back. But I think behind the recruitment problem is this issue of why should I serve? And that's something that our leaders have frankly done nothing to dispel. And in fact, I think in both parties have ended up contributing to.
Thank you. Something I know we're deeply concerned about. Again, most governors with our National Guard, we're facing some of the similar issues when it comes to recruitment and retaining those the very best of our citizenry.
The advantage the National Guard has is that you can make the case state by state. We're asking you to enlist to help your neighbors. So, the National Guard is generally the only place most Americans ever see an American in a uniform, in a military uniform. And the great thing about the Guard is when they see them, they're almost always there because of a disaster. They're there to help. And so they're seen as a big asset. And it seems to me that's a huge opportunity and frankly advantage that the National Guard and state governments have in recruitment compared to the federal government.
It's a great point, and I agree. Now, you've brought it up a couple times, and Governor Phil Murphy from New Jersey, who's here with us, brought it up to an earlier panel, but it's a question that I wanted to ask you. Historically, as you look back through our country's history, and you mentioned 9/11, which I think is the best and most recent example, we think about how we treated each other on 9/12, right? The day after, the weeks after, months, and I would say even years. There was certainly a tale to the way we got along, the way we worked together. Those types of disasters and tragedies tend to bring us together in those ways. And I guess the question is it possible to do that in a time of peace, in a time where there isn't a tragedy? We did have a global pandemic. I don't think it brought us together the same way that 9/11 did. And in fact, maybe by definition, a pandemic keeps us apart where we can't physically see each other. We're supposed to separate ourselves. So maybe that's a little different, but you've seen the way that military conflict can unite or divide a country. Any thoughts on ways we can work to bring us together to help with that sense of patriotism that doesn't need a national disaster or an attack from a foreign enemy?
Well, I think as I mentioned earlier, I think it took us a long time to get where we are, and I think it'll take a long time for us to get to a better place. But I actually think the only way, absent a disaster or a war or something like that, frankly, is for political leaders to set an example for the rest of Americans of civility, of dealing respectfully with one another, of being willing to disagree, but as your title says, disagree better in terms of having respect for the other person. Stop this business of calling the person you disagree with your enemy or somebody who's out to destroy America. I mean, that's kind of new in our political dialogue. Before, we've always had some outliers in Congress, let's face it, who were a little on the crazy side, on both the left and the right. But the bulk of the Congress basically treated each other, at least in public, respectfully, and frankly, a lot of them were friends. In many respects, one of the most negative things that happened I think in recent decades was when they went to a 3-day week in the Congress. So now they're fundraising 4 days a week, and they're only in session 3 days a week. And they don't have a chance to get to know each other. They don't even know, the members of the same party don't even know each other very well. Whereas for most of my career, these people, these political leaders would, they'd play golf together, their families would do things together, their kids would be in Little League or whatever. And it's pretty tough to demonize somebody who's a friend or who you just had to dinner or something like that. So I think there have been some structural changes that have contributed to the ugliness in the Congress and the way they treat each other. But I think that this starts with political leaders, whether it's at the state level or at the local level or at the national level, showing respect and civility for one another despite their disagreements, and to set an example for the American people, including on the cable news shows. And because, partisans on both sides watch their own cable shows. So if the politicians who are on those shows and being interviewed show some respect and some dignity, offer some dignity to the people they're disagreeing with, that begins to set a standard that maybe over time filters back down into our society. But it's got to start with leaders, and that's the whole definition.
Excellent. We agree. We have a few minutes left. I want to make sure we get a chance for our governors or others to ask some questions. Any questions from our governors? All right. Seeing none, let me ask this.
I will say one of the things that I enjoy the most, people will say to me, how in the world could you work for two people as different as Barack Obama and George W. Bush? And I always like to say, well, you forget I worked for Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. So it is possible.
I do love that. I did want to ask the question, as a student of history, and I know you are there any leaders or examples from history that you look to specifically on this issue that you think would be instructive for us, either from our own history in this country or from other places across the world?
Well, I think that there have been, my own reckoning is that in the post-war period, post-World War II period, there have actually been only 3 presidents, I think, that half the American people didn't really loathe. That 3 presidents where half the American people didn't kind of hate them. One was Dwight Eisenhower, one was Ronald Reagan, and one was George H.W. Bush. It wasn't that people agreed with them on everything by far, not at all. But they set a tone in their attitude. The friendship between Reagan and Tip O'Neill and so on, I think set a standard that the others could have emulated. But it's there are examples, and there are some, historically some very strange friendships. For example, in the United States Senate, Utah's Orrin Hatch and Massachusetts' Edward Kennedy were very close friends and cooperated on education bills and various other things. Alan Simpson had friendships on the left end of the Democratic spectrum as well. And so you do have examples of people of members of Congress who rose above the partisanship and would work together. And the problem is most of that's behind the scenes, and most Americans don't realize that those kinds of relationships between political adversaries actually do exist, but nobody pays any attention.
Excellent, thank you. Well, we have so appreciated your message today. It's been incredibly insightful and helpful. I do want to give you the last word, and I would ask if there's a sense for if there is some optimism in there that you could share with us your message again to the governors, to the many people that we have convened here today. How can we get ourselves out of this? Anything you would like us to know before we say goodbye?
Well, one of the things that I would say really has to do with the National Governors Association. I ended up spending a fair amount of time when I was secretary because of National Guard issues and our use of the National Guard overseas and so on. But I think actually, for the most part, the governors set a standard significantly above that of the Congress in terms of treating their political opponents with respect, and governors of different parties of the two different parties working together and having constructive dialogues and so on. The problem is you all need to get the media in those meetings so that people can actually see that people do have the ability to work together from different political vantage points and even as political adversaries in many instances. But I always was grateful when there was a United States senator who had been a governor, because they'd actually run something, and the Congress is the best or worst example of great power with no responsibility. Governors understood the importance of responsibility and accepting responsibility for what you say as well as what you do. And so I would just encourage you in this endeavor that you're engaged in, and for the National Governors Association to continue working on this problem. That may be the best place to start, frankly.
Well, we cannot thank you enough for your incredible service to our country, to our many presidents. We honor you. We're grateful for your wisdom today. Lots of governors who like that idea of having more governors in the U.S. Senate. I think I saw some heads nodding out there. So we appreciate your sacrifice and your service, and pray that God continues to bless you in this work. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.